On April 7, 2026, at approximately 11:40 in the morning, an Iranian anti-ship missile struck the USS Tarawa somewhere between the bow and the forward deck. I heard the impact before I understood it. Not an explosion the way you imagine an explosion. A concussion. A pressure wave that hit my chest before my ears registered the sound. The way a car door slamming too close to your face hits you before you hear it. The ship lurched. I went sideways into a bulkhead. And when I found my footing and looked toward the source of the sound, the forward section of the Tarawa was on fire. I was in the water 11 minutes later. I was in the Strait of Hormuz, in Iranian territorial waters under active combat conditions, holding a man who could not hold himself up, with no radio, no GPS, no flare, and no idea which direction was safe. The Iranian coast was approximately 9 kilometers to my north. I could see it. I could see the lights of what I assumed was a military installation blinking at the edge of the dark. The burning ship was behind me. The water around me was covered in fuel. And 20 minutes after I went in, when I had stopped believing that anyone was going to find us before the fuel caught fire or the cold finished what the missile had started, a man appeared on the surface of that water and said my name. Before we go further, leave a comment right now, telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this story is reaching today. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 31 years old. I am a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, Force Reconnaissance, currently assigned to the 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion, out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. On April 7, 2026, I was one of 42 Marines aboard the USS Tarawa when she was struck by an Iranian Noor anti-ship missile in the Strait of Hormuz during the 3rd week of Operation Iron Tide. 17 men did not make it off that ship. The Navy lists them on a wall in Norfolk now. I have been to that wall once. I will go back. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you what happened, because the what happened only means what it means when you understand the who. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the second of 3 boys. I want to tell you about Knoxville and about growing up in it before I tell you anything else, because the place and the family shaped who I was in that water, and who I was in that water is the whole point. Knoxville is not a city that announces itself. It is the kind of city that you understand from the inside, rather than from the outside, that rewards the person who grew up in it with a specific kind of foundational steadiness, rather than the more portable competencies of larger cities. The Tennessee hills are present on 3 sides, and the river is present on the 4th, and the combination of those things produces a landscape that has a permanence to it, a quality of having been there before you and intending to be there after, that I think shapes people without their knowing it. We lived in a neighborhood called Fountain City, north of downtown, in a house my parents had bought before I was born, and still lived in when I came home after the Strait of Hormuz. The house had a porch my father had built himself when I was 7, the kind of porch that becomes the center of a family's summer life, where conversations happen that do not happen indoors, because indoors has a different quality to it. My father drank his coffee on that porch every morning in good weather. My mother read in the evenings when the light was right. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the second of 3 boys. My father, Robert Webb, worked 31 years for the Tennessee Valley Authority as an electrical engineer. My mother, Diane Webb, taught 8th grade history at the same middle school for 24 years. We were a church family. First Presbyterian on Kingston Pike, every Sunday, 11 o'clock service, sit in the same pew, shake the same hands, sing the same hymns. I believed in God the way I believed in TVA electricity. It was there. It worked. I did not think about the mechanism. My father was the kind of man who did not say much, but when he said something, you wrote it down internally without meaning to. He coached my Little League team for 4 years, not because he loved baseball particularly, but because that was where his sons were, and that was where he intended to be. My mother read the Bible every morning before the rest of the house was awake. I would come down for water at 6 in the morning sometimes, and find her at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, and the Bible open and a cup of coffee going cold beside her because she had forgotten to drink it. I thought it was a habit, an adult custom, something people did because they had always done it. I enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18, not because I had run out of options or because I had nothing else available. My grades were good enough for college and my father had put money aside and the option was present and real. I enlisted because the decision had been made in me before I had the vocabulary to articulate it, settled sometime around the age of 12 when something clicked into place between who I was and what I understood the Corps to be. I was not running from anything. I was running toward something specific. My father drove me to the MEPS station in Knoxville on a Tuesday in August. He was quiet on the drive, which was not unusual for him. He shook my hand in the parking lot, which was. My father was not a handshaking man as a habit. He reserved the gesture for occasions that warranted the formality, which told me he understood that what was about to happen was the kind of thing that warranted the formality. He looked at me with the expression he kept for the moments when he was saying something important, with fewer words than the moment deserved. He said, "You know what you're doing." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Then go do it." He got back in the car. I went inside. I did not know until years later that when he got back in the car, he sat there for a while before driving home. My mother told me that. She said he came home looking like he had been somewhere difficult. She said he went to the garage and stayed there for 2 hours, which was where he went when he was processing something. I enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18. Not because I had run out of options or because I had nothing else available. I enlisted because I had wanted to since I was 12 years old and had spent 6 years not changing my mind. My mother cried when I told her, not in front of me. My father told me later she had cried in the kitchen after I went upstairs. What she said to my father, and what he told me years later when I was already deployed, was that she had asked God that night to go where she couldn't go. I did not know she said that. I want you to hold that fact. I went to Paris Island, and then to Camp Lejeune, and then to the School of Infantry, and then through the selection pipeline for force reconnaissance, which is not a pipeline designed to make you comfortable about your own mortality. You come out the other side of it with a very specific relationship to physical hardship and a very specific relationship to the idea that your body has capabilities you have not fully tested yet. What you do not come out with, or what I did not come out with, is any clear sense of what you believe about God. I had drifted from the Sunday morning pew to the Sunday morning run without any particular theological decision. It was not that I rejected what I had been raised in. It was that it had simply stopped being relevant in any practical sense. The Marine Corps gave me a framework for living that was immediate and physical and demanding and communal. And the faith of my childhood was none of those things in any way I could access. It was background, something my mother did. Something that happened at 11 o'clock on Sunday at First Presbyterian on Kingston Pike, in a life that increasingly felt like it belonged to someone else. My platoon commander was First Lieutenant Daniel Carver from Midland, Texas, 27 years old. I want to tell you about Danny properly, before I tell you about the water, because who he was matters enormously for what happened out there, and because the promise that was made to me in that water was a promise about him specifically. And for that promise to carry the weight it carries, you need to understand who it was being made about. Danny had grown up outside Midland on a cattle operation his family had run for 3 generations. He was the first Carver to go to college, Texas A&M on an ROTC scholarship, and he had graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering and a commission as a second lieutenant. And the combination of those things, the engineering mind and the ranching background, and the particular quality of unhurried confidence that comes from growing up in a place where things die if you panic and things live if you stay methodical, had produced an officer who was unusual. He did not perform leadership. He practiced it. He thought out loud when thinking out loud was useful, and he was quiet when quiet was useful, and he never confused the two. He had a habit of stopping and looking at things, not staring, not spacing out, looking in the deliberate way of someone who is collecting information before making a judgment. I had seen him do it with equipment and with terrain and with people, that specific moment of focused observation before the decision. He applied it to everything, including, I eventually understood, to the people he served with, which meant he understood his Marines in a way that officers who moved through the environment without fully entering it did not understand them. He was the kind of man whose faith was not a compartment. It was not something he kept separate from the operational environment and took out on Sundays. It was present all the time in the way that a good foundation is present in a building, not visible, but load-bearing. He did not discuss it unless asked. He did not use it as a management tool or a bonding mechanism. He simply lived it, in the same way he lived everything else, from the inside out. I want to tell you about Danny before I tell you about the water, because Danny is the reason I am alive, and I need you to understand who it was that I was trying to keep above the surface out there. Danny had been my platoon commander for 14 months. He was the kind of officer who did not put distance between himself and the men he led in the way that some officers use distance as a management tool. He was present. He was honest about what he did not know. He made decisions quickly and owned the outcomes. His family ran cattle outside Midland, and he had a wife named Claire and a daughter named Grace, who was 11 months old when we deployed, old enough to sit up but not yet walking. And he had a photo of the three of them on the inside of his locker door that he looked at every morning before muster. He was devout in a way I had not encountered before outside of my family. Not performatively. He prayed before meals without making it a statement. He kept a small New Testament in his left breast pocket, the same pocket every day. Once during a particularly bad week of training, I heard him praying quietly in his bunk after lights out, not loudly. Just talking, the way you talk to someone sitting next to you rather than someone at a distance. I did not say anything. It was not my business, and he was not making it anyone's business. But I noticed it. I want to tell you about the Strait of Hormuz before I tell you about what happened there, because the geography matters, and most people know the name without knowing what the name means operationally. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through those 21 miles passes approximately 20% of the world's traded oil every day, which means it is one of the most economically significant choke points on the planet and one of the most politically contested. The northern coast is Iranian. The southern coast is Omani. Iranian naval vessels have patrolled those waters aggressively for decades, and the traffic through the strait, the tankers and the container ships and the navy vessels, operates under a continuous awareness of Iranian military capability that is part of every navigation brief and every operational plan.
The current moves northeast through the center of the strait and southwest along the edges. The tides are influenced by both the Gulf of Oman to the east and the Persian Gulf to the west in ways that create complex local conditions that experienced mariners respect. At night, the strait is dark in a way that open ocean is dark, which is a comprehensive dark, the kind without the ambient glow of distant civilization, where the only lights are the running lights of other vessels and the occasional coastal installation and whatever the sky provides, which on an overcast night is nothing. It was into this water that I went on April 7th. I want you to have that picture before I tell you what was in it.
When Operation Iron Tide began in mid-March of 2026, our battalion was attached to the amphibious ready group centered on the USS Tarawa, an amphibious assault ship carrying Marines, helicopters, and the specific combination of firepower and flexibility that the Strait of Hormuz situation required. The operational tempo was high from the first week. We flew missions into the Omani side. We conducted maritime interdiction ops. We ran fast rope insertions onto suspected smuggling vessels. The days ran together in the specific blur of sustained operations where sleep is a resource you ration rather than a need you meet. By early April, the Iranian response to American operations had escalated in ways that the intelligence briefs had not fully anticipated. They were using mobile anti-ship missile batteries positioned along the northern coast of the strait, the same tactic of hiding and waiting that the Air Force had encountered with their surface-to-air systems. The Tarawa had adequate defensive systems. Every ship in those waters did. The problem with adequate defensive systems is that adequacy is a statistical concept, and statistics allow for outliers. We were the outlier on April 7th. I was on the main deck running a pre-mission equipment check with Danny and 4 other Marines when the missile hit. The impact point was approximately 30 meters forward of our position, below the main deck, somewhere in the forward spaces where the marine berthing was. The explosion came up through the deck as much as it came from the side, a vertical force that knocked every man off his feet before the horizontal shockwave finished the job. I went into the bulkhead on my right side, hit my shoulder hard enough to feel it immediately, and came back to my feet to find the world on fire on the forward horizon. Danny was on the deck. He had gone down harder than the rest of us, catching his head on a deck fitting on the way down. He was conscious, but not fully operational, the specific unfocused quality of someone whose brain has just been percussed and is rebooting. Blood was coming from above his ear, running down the side of his face in the particular dark red of a scalp wound. I got to him. I got my arm under his. He said something I did not fully hear over the alarms and the sound of the fire. The next 8 minutes were the specific controlled chaos of a ship that is dying and knows it. The abandoned ship signal went. People were moving in every direction with the trained efficiency of people who have drilled this and the specific animal fear of people for whom drill has become reality. I had Danny up and moving. He could walk with support. His coordination was compromised, and his left side was not tracking properly, which meant the head impact had done something neurological that I was not qualified to assess and was not going to be able to treat until we were somewhere other than a burning ship. We went over the side together. Not from a life raft station. We went over the rail because the life raft station on our side was engulfed by the time we reached it, and the other option was moving back toward the fire, and moving back toward the fire on a ship that is actively dying is not a survivable calculation. The water was cold. Not cold the way pool water is cold. Cold the way the Strait of Hormuz is cold in April, which is a functional cold, the kind that begins telling your body things about your future within the first 30 seconds of immersion. Danny was not fully able to swim. He was conscious and trying, but his left arm was not cooperating, and the head injury had compromised his spatial orientation in a way that made coordinated swimming impossible. I got him on his back. I got my arm across his chest. I started moving us away from the ship. The fuel in the water was what kept me moving when everything else was telling me to stop. The Tarawa was leaking fuel from the damage, and the fuel was spreading on the surface in the specific iridescent pattern that hydrocarbons make on water, catching light in colors that would be beautiful in any context that wasn't this one. If the fuel caught fire, we were inside the radius. Moving was not optional. I swam us away from the ship for what I estimated was 15 minutes. The current in the strait was working against me, pushing us northeast, which was in the direction of the Iranian coast. I could see the lights on the northern horizon getting incrementally closer. I could see the burning ship behind me getting incrementally smaller. I could not see any other survivors in the water near me, which did not mean there were none. It meant it was dark enough and choppy enough that my visual range was limited. I stopped when my left arm gave out. Not stopped entirely. I found a floating piece of debris from the ship, a section of some kind of equipment housing that was large enough to provide buoyancy for both of us, and I got Danny onto it and kept my own hand on it and let my body rest in the water for 2 minutes that felt like 10. Danny was in and out of useful consciousness. He had moments of clarity where he would look at me and say something coherent, and moments where his eyes were open, but the processing behind them had gone somewhere else. The scalp wound was still bleeding. I had put pressure on it when I could, but pressure on a scalp wound while swimming in open water is not a sustainable intervention. My radio had gone into the water with me. Military radios are water-resistant to a certain depth and a certain duration, but I had gone deeper than the rating on the way in, and when I keyed it, nothing came back. My GPS was reading, but the signal was degraded in a way that made the position readout unreliable. I had one flare. I was saving the flare for when I heard a helicopter, because using it before I heard a helicopter was spending a one-time asset on a maybe. The temperature in the water was doing what water temperature does to a human body in immersion. The process has a clinical name, progressive hypothermia, and it has a timeline that varies by water temperature and body mass and physical condition. I knew the timeline. I had been trained on the timeline. Knowing the timeline does not change it. I want to tell you what it is like to be in that water in that situation, because the physical reality of it is important for understanding what came after. It is quiet in a way you do not expect. The chaos of the ship, the alarms and the fire and the shouting, is behind you and receding, and what replaces it is the sound of water and your own breathing, and the specific internal sound of your body working hard to maintain a core temperature that the environment is continuously trying to reduce. The darkness is comprehensive. The lights of the Iranian coast to the north are visible, but they are not close enough to be useful, and they represent a threat rather than a destination. The burning ship behind you is the only significant light source in your immediate environment, and it is the light of something that is finished rather than something that can help you. And in that darkness and that cold and that quiet, the mind goes to specific places that it does not go in ordinary circumstances. It goes to the people who are most real to you. I thought about my mother. I thought about her at the kitchen table before sunrise with her Bible open and her coffee going cold. I thought about what she would find out and when she would find it out and what the specific moment of finding out would be like for her. And that thought was the hardest thought I had in that water. I thought about Danny's daughter, Grace, 11 months old enough to sit up, not yet walking. I thought about a child who would grow up without a father who had her photograph on the inside of his locker door and prayed quietly after lights out and carried a New Testament in his left breast pocket every day. I thought about that in a way that made the cold in my body feel secondary to a different kind of cold. I prayed. I want to be honest about this because honesty is the point of this account, and honesty requires me to describe the prayer accurately, rather than in the version that sounds better in retrospect. The prayer was not the prayer of a man who had maintained an active and consistent relationship with God. It was not the prayer of someone who had been in regular conversation with a God they trusted. It was the prayer of someone who has been in a room alone for a long time and has heard a noise that suggests maybe the room is not as empty as they thought and is speaking toward the noise before they have confirmed there is anyone there to hear them. It was the prayer of someone with nothing left. Not nothing in the dramatic, poetic sense. Nothing in the literal sense. No radio, no GPS, no flare, no other survival assets of consequence. A man who could not swim on his own. A body that was spending its thermal reserves at a rate that had a calculable endpoint, and an Iranian coast getting incrementally closer. I had exhausted the available resources, and the available resources had not produced an exit from the situation. The prayer was what came next. Not as a first resort, or as a considered theological decision. As the thing at the bottom of the stack reached when everything above it had been used. I said it into the dark of the Strait of Hormuz while holding a piece of debris with one hand and keeping my platoon commander's head above the surface with the other. I prayed. I want to be honest about this because honesty is the point of this account. I prayed in the way that a person prays, who has not prayed in years and has not thought carefully about prayer in longer than that. Which is to say, I did not pray with any theological structure or any specific address or any particular confidence that I was being heard. I prayed the way a person calls out in a dark room, not knowing if anyone is there, but calling because the alternative is silence, and silence in that moment was not an option I had any more reserves to choose. I said, if anyone is there, I cannot do this alone. Danny has a daughter. He has a wife. I need help. I cannot let him die in this water. I need help. I said it into the dark of the Strait of Hormuz, while holding a piece of debris with one hand and keeping my platoon commander's head above the surface with the other. 20 minutes after we went in, the light appeared. I want to be careful about how I tell you this part, because it is the part that people will apply their own framework to, and I cannot control what framework you use, and I am not going to try. I am going to tell you what I saw. What I saw was a light on the surface of the water approximately 15 meters from where we were. A light that did not have an identifiable source, not a flashlight or a flare, or the reflection of anything burning. A light that existed on the surface of the water the way a lamp exists in a room, independently, steadily, without being attached to anything. And then a man. He was standing on the water. I am going to say that plainly because that is what I saw, and I am not going to find a softer version of it to make it easier to receive. He was standing on the surface of the Strait of Hormuz, the way a person stands on a dock, upright, still, not struggling with the water or the current or the cold. He was wearing white, the kind of white that is its own light source rather than a color that reflects light. He was looking at me, not at Danny, who was behind me, at me specifically, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who has been watching for a while and has been waiting for the right moment to speak. My hand went to the sidearm at my hip before my brain had caught up with my nervous system. Training, threat response. My fingers closed on the grip, and I had the weapon halfway out of the holster before something stopped my hand. Not a physical force. Something that arrived before the physical action was complete, a recognition that preceded the thought. The same way you recognize a voice before you identify it. My hand released the grip. He said my name. Marcus, not Sergeant Webb. Marcus. My given name. The name my mother used. The name that belonged to the version of me that existed before rank and the Corps and all the years of becoming something harder and more useful and less personal than the boy who grew up in Knoxville. He said it the way you say the name of someone you have known their entire life, with the specific weight of history behind it, with the knowledge that the name represents not just a person, but everything that person has been since before they were old enough to be anything. Then he said, "Let go of the debris. I have you. And I want to tell you about the 3 seconds between when he said that and when I let go of the debris, because those 3 seconds contain the most important decision I have ever made, and I want to give them the weight they deserve. In Force Recon, we train for the moments when every available piece of information points in one direction and one input points in a different direction. We train for those moments because those are the moments where people die. When the mission intelligence says one thing and what you are observing on the ground says another, you have to decide which one to trust, and you have to decide fast, and you have to own the outcome. The training is designed to make that decision process faster and cleaner and more reliable under pressure. It is good training. I have been in situations where it saved lives. The training said, "Do not let go of the debris." The training said, "The debris is buoyancy, and buoyancy is survival, and giving up buoyancy without a guaranteed alternative in the water at night, in hostile territory, is a decision that ends with 2 men going under." Every input I had been trained to trust was on the side of hold on. The man standing on the water said, "Let go." And something in me, something that operated underneath the training and underneath the survival calculation and underneath the professional discipline that the Corps had built over 13 years, something that was older than all of that, said yes. I let go. I want to tell you about the 3 seconds between when he said that and when I let go of the debris, because those 3 seconds are the most important 3 seconds of my life, and I want to give them the weight they deserve. Letting go of the debris meant trusting my weight and Danny's weight to the water with no buoyancy support. It meant the survival calculation I had been running for the past 20 minutes, the one that said, "Hold on, do not let go. The debris is between you and the water taking you under," was being overridden by a man standing on the surface of the ocean who had said my name. Every instinct I had been trained to trust was on one side of that decision. Something else was on the other side. I let go. We did not go under. I want to tell you that simply, without embellishment, because the simplicity of it is the point. We did not go under. The water held us the way solid ground holds you, with a completeness and a certainty that the water of the Strait of Hormuz does not possess, and that I have no mechanical explanation for. Danny was on his back beside me. I was upright in the water. We were not sinking. The man was close now, 3 meters. I could see him with the specific clarity that the light he carried made possible, a clarity that had nothing to do with the ambient darkness around us or the distance or the conditions that should have made visibility in that water essentially zero. I saw his face. I am not going to describe his face in detail, because I have attempted that description on multiple occasions, and the description is always inadequate in the same specific way, which is that the face was ordinary in all its individual components and completely extraordinary in the combination of them and in the quality of the expression on it. The expression was the part I could not describe. I have called it recognition in subsequent accounts, which is the closest word I have found. not the recognition of someone who has encountered you before. The recognition of someone who has known you from before you knew yourself. He said, "I know where they are looking for you. I know the currents in this water. Hold on to your man and follow me." And before I had fully processed the instruction, he was moving, walking on the surface of the water in the direction of the Omani coast, moving south and west away from the Iranian lights, moving at a pace that was possible for me to match in the water, but that should not have been possible for a man walking on a liquid surface. I put my arm under Danny and I followed. Before we go further, I need you to do something. If you are watching this right now, and something in you has shifted, if there is a part of you that is recognizing something in this account that you did not expect to recognize, leave a comment right now. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. Tell me your name if you want to. Because what happens next in this water is for you too. And I need you to stay with me. The next 4 hours were the most physically difficult of my life, and I have a list of experiences to compare them to. That is not short. I want to describe those hours with the specificity they deserve, because the physical reality of what they cost is part of what makes what held us up in them remarkable. The current in the Strait of Hormuz is not a uniform current. It operates in layers and in channels, and it changes behavior depending on depth and tide and the presence of other vessels displacing water nearby. In the first hour, I was fighting it directly, swimming against a northeast drift that was moving us toward the Iranian coast, at a rate that I was calculating in the back of my mind, with the automatic threat assessment that the Corps had built into me. And the calculation was not producing reassuring numbers. The man ahead of us was navigating these currents the way someone navigates a familiar house in the dark, not by memorized coordinates, but by intimate knowledge, turning when the turn was needed, angling when the angle reduced resistance, finding the channels where the water was working with us, rather than against us, in a way that I could feel in my body as soon as he found them. The cold was the other constant. Cold in water immersion works on a curve that starts manageable and becomes less so at a pace that is function of temperature and time and body mass, and the specific energy expenditure of swimming versus floating. I was swimming, carrying a man who could not fully contribute. My core temperature was doing what core temperatures do in those conditions, and the part of my brain that was tracking the survival metrics was noting the trajectory with the professional detachment of a medic reading a patient's vitals in a situation where there is nothing else to do but note them and keep moving. What I want to tell you about is what was happening in a different part of me simultaneously. The part that was not running survival calculations. The part that was following a figure of light on the surface of the water with a certainty that had no rational basis and needed none. That part was the warmest thing about me in those 4 hours, and I do not mean that metaphorically. The next 4 hours were the most physically difficult of my life, and I have a list of experiences to compare them to that includes force recon selection and multiple combat deployments, and the kind of physical training that the Marine Corps uses to find out what you are made of at the cellular level. The current in the strait was working against us the entire time. The water temperature was conducting heat out of my body at a rate that the part of my mind that was tracking survival metrics was noting with professional concern. Danny was 190 pounds, and he was not contributing to his own propulsion. The man in white moved ahead of us, and I followed him. And I want to tell you what that following was like, because it was unlike any following I have done in any other context. He moved us through the water with a knowledge of it that was not the knowledge of charts or tide tables or navigation experience. It was the knowledge of someone who made the water, who knows every current and every channel and every thermal layer from the inside, rather than from observation. He turned when a current would have pushed us into a shipping lane. He accelerated when a patrol boat came within range, and I could hear the engine sound crossing the dark before I could see the lights. And the patrol boat passed within 300 meters of our position, and its searchlight swept the water twice and found nothing. He moved us around the edge of a fuel slick that was drifting south from the Tarawa's position that I had not seen in the darkness and would have entered and would not have come back from. I was not afraid during any of it. I want to say that because it is the true thing, even though it is the hardest thing to make comprehensible. I was cold and I was exhausted, and I was carrying a wounded man through contested waters in the dark, and I was not afraid. Not because I had suppressed the fear or managed it or overcame it with discipline. Because there was a presence moving ahead of me in that water that had the quality of absolute certainty, the certainty of someone who knows the outcome before the events. And being in the vicinity of that certainty was like being in the vicinity of a fire when you are cold. It reached me. It changed the temperature of something inside me that the water could not reach. Danny regained fuller consciousness around the 90-minute mark. I felt him shift against my arm, the specific movement of a person whose body is reasserting its coordination. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were clearer than they had been at any point since the missile hit. He said, "Sergeant Webb," which was the correct response, and told me the neurological function was returning. I said, "Lieutenant." I said, "Don't move fast." I said, "I've got you." I said, "We're going to be all right." He looked forward over my shoulder. I watched his face. He was looking at the man ahead of us, the figure moving on the surface with the light around him. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said quietly, in a tone I had never heard from him before in 14 months of serving together, he said, "Do you see him?" I said, "Yes." Danny said, "I know who that is." I said, "I think I do too." We did not say anything else about it for the next hour. There was nothing that needed to be said. The knowing was sufficient. At some point past the 2-hour mark, Danny told me his arm was working again. Not fully, but enough to contribute. He began swimming alongside me rather than being carried, his right arm pulling the water in slow strokes, his left still limited but present. The difference was significant. Not just physically, though the physical relief was real and immediate. The difference was that I was no longer alone in the work of keeping us both alive, and the shift in that felt like the first warmth I had felt in 2 hours. I want to tell you about a moment somewhere in the 3rd hour that I have thought about more than any other moment in that water. The man ahead of us had stopped. He had stopped twice before, and each time it was because something was in our path that we needed to wait for. A boat, a current, something I could hear or see in the dark that confirmed the stop was necessary. This stop was different. He turned. He was facing me directly, perhaps 5 meters ahead, his face fully visible in the light that came from him, and he looked at me in a way that was not the purposeful guidance of the previous hours. It was more personal than that. It was the look of someone who wanted to make sure that what they were about to say was received rather than just heard. He said, "Marcus, you did not call on me because you believed. You called because you had nothing else. That is fine. That is how most people come to me. What I want you to know is that I was in the water before you were. I was in the water before the missile. I have been with you since before you were old enough to know my name. Your mother knew that. She asked me every morning to go where she couldn't go. I could not speak. The cold of the water had made speech an effortful thing, but this silence was not the silence of the cold. This was the silence of a man who has just been handed information that is too large to respond to with words. He said, "You asked me to keep Danny alive. I want you to know I heard you ask, and I want you to know that the 11-month-old girl in Midland is going to know her father. I cried in the Strait of Hormuz. I want to tell you that without embarrassment, because embarrassment is the wrong response to the truth. I cried in the water with Danny beside me, and a figure of light 5 meters ahead of me. And the crying was not from grief or from fear. It was the specific release of something that had been compressed under the weight of the previous 3 hours, a pressure that had been building since the moment I went over the rail with Danny's arm over my shoulder, a pressure that had nowhere to go until that moment. Then he turned and kept moving. And I kept following. The patrol boat was the moment I want to describe with the most care, because it was the moment where the rational mind, which had been running its own parallel track the entire time, documenting and assessing and filing everything under categories it would address later, hit a wall that the categories could not contain. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps operates fast patrol boats in the strait. They operate them in the dark, and they operate them aggressively, and they are very good at finding things in the water that are not supposed to be there. A patrol boat came within approximately 50 meters of our position in the third hour. I heard the engine first, that specific high-pitched whine of a fast outboard running at operational speed, and the sound resolved into the visual of a dark hull with a bow light and a searching light sweeping the water in arcs. The man ahead of us stopped. He looked back at me. He said, "Stay still. Do not move. Do not speak." The searching light swept over us. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say swept over us. I mean the beam of the searchlight passed directly across the space we occupied. I mean that the light hit us. I mean that, in the illuminated moment of that sweep, a man standing on the water and two Marines in the water should have been visible to anyone operating that light with functional eyesight. The beam passed. The boat continued on its heading. No alarm was raised. No engine change indicated deceleration or circling back. The patrol boat moved on, and the engine sound diminished, and the dark came back. Danny said very quietly, "That was close." I said nothing. Close was not the word I was reaching for. In the fourth hour, the man slowed. The quality of his movement changed. He had been moving with a consistent, unhurried purpose the entire time we had been following him. The pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going and how long it will take to get there. Now he was moving with the specific quality of approach, the way a person moves when the destination is near. He stopped ahead of us, and he turned and he pointed. Not in a direction. At a specific point on the horizon where the darkness had a slightly different texture, a quality that I identified after a moment as the quality of a vessel showing minimum lighting, a small vessel running dark with just enough light to be legal, a vessel that was holding position. He said, "There is a Zodiac from your ship waiting 200 meters ahead of you. They have been holding position for 40 minutes. They cannot see you from here. When you are within 30 meters, use the flare." I looked at the direction he had pointed. Then I looked back at him. I said, "Who are you?" He said, "You know who I am. You have known since your mother told you on Sunday mornings that you were not paying attention to." I said, "Why us? Why this water? Why tonight?" He said something then that I am going to give you exactly as he gave it to me, because the words have been in me since that night, and I have thought about every part of them every day since. He said, "Marcus, you ask why you, but that is not the question that matters. The question that matters is what you do with Sunday mornings, now that there is no missile and no dark water to make the choice obvious. I am as present on the days when you do not need me to be visible. The difference is whether you are looking for me." "Tonight you called," I answered. "I have been answering since before you were old enough to call." And then he said, "Go. Danny's daughter is waiting for him to come home." I looked at the direction of the Zodiac. I looked back. He was gone. No diminishing light, no retreating figure. The water was dark and empty, and the place where he had been was water, the same as any other water, except that it was not the same water to me and never would be again. I said to Danny, "Use your right arm. 200 meters. Danny said, "I'm with you." We swam. I lit the flare at 30 meters from the Zodiac's position. The orange smoke caught on the second strike, and I held it up, and the Zodiac's engine changed pitch immediately, that specific acceleration of a small craft responding to a signal it has been waiting for, and the bow light swung in our direction, and the engine note was the most specific sound I've ever heard in my life. They pulled Danny in first. Then they got an arm under mine, and I came over the rubber gunnel and onto the floor of the Zodiac, and I lay there for a moment on my back, looking up at the stars over the Strait of Hormuz, while someone wrapped a thermal blanket around me, and someone else was checking Danny's head wound and asking him questions and getting coherent answers. The Marine driving the Zodiac was a lance corporal I recognized from our battalion named Strickland. He looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has been sitting in a rubber boat in hostile waters for 40 minutes, looking for people he was not certain were alive. He said, "Sergeant, how did you get this far from the Tarawa?" I said, "Someone showed me the way." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Get warm, Sergeant," and turned back to the helm. At the Fleet Surgical Facility in Muscat, Oman, where they flew us 6 hours later, a Navy doctor examined my hands. He was looking at the skin condition as an indicator of hypothermia progression. He said to the nurse beside him, "This man was in that water for over 4 hours." He looked at me and said, "Captain, at the water temperature in the Strait tonight, and the immersion duration, you should have a core temperature 2 to 3 degrees below what I'm reading." He said, "I cannot explain this." I said, "I know." He made a note and moved on. Military doctors in combat support hospitals develop a specific relationship with unexplained findings. They document them and continue because there are more patients and more immediate needs, and the documentation will be someone else's problem when the operational tempo allows for problems that are not immediately clinical. Danny was in surgery for 3 hours. The head injury had caused a subdural hematoma, a collection of blood on the brain from the impact, that required evacuation before it caused permanent damage. The surgeon came out and told me it had been caught in time. Another hour, and the outcome would have been different. He said the surgery went well. He said Danny would have a recovery process that was longer than Danny would prefer, but that he expected full return of function. He said, "Your man is going to be fine." I called my mother from the hospital in Muscat at 3 in the morning Oman time, which was 9 in the evening in Knoxville. She answered on the first ring. She had been watching the news. CNN had been running the Tarawa story since the afternoon. She had been in her kitchen, which is where she goes when she is afraid, at the table with her Bible and a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside her. I told her I was all right. I heard her exhale the way a person exhales when a breath has been held for hours. Then she asked about my men, about Danny, the way she always asked about the people I was with, because she had always understood that the people I was with were part of what she was praying for. I told her about Danny and the surgery and what the doctor had said. She said, "Thank God." Not as an expression, as an actual address. Then I told her. All of it, the water, the man, the words, the moment where the searchlight swept over us and found nothing. I told her about what he said, about her mornings, about the prayer she had prayed that I had not known she was praying. My mother was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, in a voice that had a quality I had not heard in it before, something between complete stillness and complete fullness, she said, "Marcus, every morning since you joined the Marine Corps, I asked him to go where I couldn't go." I said, "Mom, I know. He told me." She made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she started crying. Not the crying of the mother who has been watching the news for 6 hours, waiting for confirmation that her son is alive. The other kind. The kind that goes with something arriving that has been waited for. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed in Muscat, Oman, with the phone against my ear and the Strait of Hormuz outside the window somewhere, invisible in the dark, and I thought about 31 years of Sunday mornings that I had been present for in body and elsewhere in every other sense. I thought about the kitchen table and the open Bible and the cold coffee. I thought about the pew at First Presbyterian on Kingston Pike and the hymns I knew the words to without knowing why I knew them. I thought about a God I had accepted the way I accepted gravity, present and real and entirely unengaged with until the night the gravity failed and something else held us up. I said, "Mom, I'm going to start paying attention on Sunday mornings." She said, "I know you are, baby. I want to tell you about the debrief that happened 2 days after we were extracted, because the debrief is part of the account and it belongs here." 2 officers from Naval Intelligence came to the facility in Muscat where I was recovering, and they sat across a table from me, and they asked me to describe the route we had taken through the water from the Tarawa's last position to the extraction point. I described it as accurately as I could from memory, which was more accurate than they seemed to expect, given the conditions and duration. Then one of them turned a laptop toward me that showed a map of the strait with our route plotted against a layer of data showing Iranian naval vessel tracks, patrol boat routes, and known operating areas for the 4-hour window in question. The route we had taken went between every one of those threat elements with a margin that the officer described as inconsistent with any navigation that could be achieved by dead reckoning or chance in those conditions, and at night, without instruments. He said the route appeared to have been chosen with access to real-time intelligence on Iranian vessel movements. He asked if I had received any information from a source I had not yet disclosed. I said no. He said, "Sergeant, I need to understand how you navigated this route." I said, "I followed someone who knew where the threats were." He said, "Can you describe this person?" I described what I had seen. The light, the white clothing, the walking on the surface. I described it plainly and completely, and I watched his face while I described it, and his face did the thing that faces do when they are receiving information that does not fit into any available category and are deciding how to categorize it anyway. He made notes. He asked 2 follow-up questions. Then he closed the laptop and said, "Sergeant, your account will be included in the after-action report. I want to be clear that we are not in a position to assess certain elements of your account from an intelligence standpoint, but the route data is documented and consistent with your description of being guided by an external party with tactical awareness." He said, "external party." I did not correct the language. 6 weeks later, Danny Carver went home to Midland, Texas. I was there when he landed. His wife Claire was at the airport with Grace on her hip, 13 months old now, not walking yet but close. Danny came through the gate on a cane, his left side still compensating for what the recovery process had not yet fully returned, and Claire walked toward him and then ran the last 10 meters, and Grace was between them, her small hands gripping both of them, and the 3 of them stood in the middle of that airport in a configuration that was its own kind of testimony. I stood back. Some moments are not for observation. Some moments are the answer to a prayer, and the right response to an answer is to let it be complete. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Danny in the hospital in Muscat before he was flown to Germany for surgery. He was post-op from the initial procedures they had done to stabilize the hematoma, not yet fully clear but functional enough for a conversation. I sat beside his bed and we talked for about 40 minutes, the way men talk who have been through something together that most people have not been through and are navigating the transition back to a world where it is not the only reality. At some point he asked me directly about the man in the water. He had been conscious for part of it. He had seen the light. He had heard the voice. But the neurological events of the day had compressed his memory of the sequence in ways that left gaps. I told him what I had seen and heard. I told him what was said. I told him specifically what was said about Grace. He was quiet for a long time after that. His eyes were on the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice had the specific quiet of a man who is not performing composure, but who has arrived at it through the actual thing, through moving through the weight of something rather than around it. He said, "I prayed when I was in the water, before I was fully conscious, not in language, just underneath. And I felt answered before I had fully formulated the asking. I said I understood that." He said, "My daughter is going to grow up knowing that her father was in the Strait of Hormuz and Jesus Christ walked us home." I said yes. He said, "That is going to shape her entire life." I said, "I think that is the point." He closed his eyes. I sat there for a while longer. Then I went back to my own bed and lay there in the dark of the hospital in Muscat, Oman, and thought about what the point was, about why us, about what is supposed to happen next in the lives of 2 men who followed a figure of light across the surface of an ocean and came out the other side. I did not have complete answers to those questions then. I do not have complete answers now. What I have is a direction. What I have is the memory of a voice saying my name in dark water and the certainty that has come with me from that water into every subsequent day. The certainty that the presence I followed in the strait is the same presence available in every morning that does not involve a missile or dark water, equally real in those mornings, less visible because there is no darkness to make the light obvious. On the flight home to Knoxville, I had a window seat over the Atlantic, and I thought about what he had said in the water. The question about Sunday mornings. The question about what I was going to do on the days when there was no dark water, and no missile and no cold and no reason to look for him that was as obvious as the reason in the strait had been. He had said he was as present on those days. He had said the difference was whether I was looking. And I thought about what looking had cost me in the strait, which was nothing, which was only the willingness to call out in the dark and receive what called back. I thought about that all the way across the Atlantic. I want to tell you about the first Sunday morning after I came home to Knoxville. I had been home for 4 days. I had slept in my own bed, eaten my mother's cooking, sat with my father in the garage while he worked on a car he was restoring, which was how my father and I had always talked, side by side and facing the same direction, which is different from face to face, and equally honest. I had called Danny twice to check on his recovery, which was progressing on schedule. I had been to the Navy and Marine Corps Relief Society meeting that the base required, and I had filled out the forms that the Corps requires, and I had done all the administrative business of being a person who came back from something. Sunday morning I woke up before my mother. I went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The Bible was on the table where it always was. The coffee maker was off. I sat in my mother's chair. I opened the Bible to a page without looking, the way people do when they want to let it find them rather than the other way around. The page it opened to was the 14th chapter of John, the passage that begins with the words, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me." I sat at that kitchen table in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I read those words, and I thought about the dark water and the figure of light moving ahead of me and the voice that said my name, and I thought about all the Sunday mornings I had sat in the pew at First Presbyterian without those words meaning anything beyond their face value. They meant something now, not because I had become a different person, because the thing the words were pointing at had made itself unmistakably visible in a way that left no room for the comfortable distance I had maintained from it for 31 years. When my mother came downstairs at 6:15, she found me sitting at her table with her Bible open in front of me. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She did not say anything. She went to the coffee maker and started it, and then she sat across from me, and she looked at me over the table with an expression that I recognized because it was the expression of a woman who has been praying for something for 13 years and has just found evidence that it has arrived. I said, "I'm coming to church with you this morning." She said, "I know." I said, "I should have been paying attention a long time ago." She said, "You're paying attention now." That was enough. That was exactly enough. I am a Marine. I am not a theologian. I am not going to stand here and explain the mechanism of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, because I do not understand the mechanism, and I distrust people who claim to. What I can tell you is what I saw and what I heard, and what held 2 men up in cold water for 4 hours, when the physics said it should not have been possible. What I can tell you is that the 17 men whose names are on the wall in Norfolk were not less loved or less prayed for than Danny and I were. That is something I have sat with since April and have not fully resolved and do not expect to fully resolve, because some things are not mine to resolve, and I have had to make my peace with the limit of what I am allowed to understand. What I can tell you is that Jesus walked ahead of me in that water, and I followed and I came out the other side, and the instruction I was given on the ridge where the pilot was given his instruction in the desert was the same instruction in different words, which is, "Now you know. What are you going to do with Sunday mornings when there is no missile and no dark water?" I have an answer to that question now. And the answer is what this account is, the telling of it, the willingness to sit in front of people I do not know and describe a night in the Strait of Hormuz and what was in the water that night, and what it said to me and what it has required of me since. That is the answer. The going, the telling, the paying attention. The Sunday mornings. What I can tell you is what I saw and what I heard and what held 2 men up in cold water for 4 hours when the physics said it should not have been possible. What I can tell you is that the route we took through that water, which was documented by Navy intelligence afterward, avoided every known Iranian patrol position and vessel track in the area with a precision that the intelligence analyst described as statistically inconsistent with dead reckoning or chance. What I can tell you is that Danny Carver's daughter knows her father. What I can tell you is that my mother has been talking to someone in that kitchen every morning for 13 years, and she was right. He was there. He went where she couldn't go. He found me in the water and he said my name and he walked us home. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, I want to ask you to do one thing. Leave a comment with 4 words. He walked us home. That is all. Because every time I read those words, I will know that one more person understands what happened in that water. One more person who knows that Jesus does not wait for you to have the right theology before he answers. One more person who knows that the question is not whether you believed when you called. The question is what you do on Sunday mornings when there is no dark water to make the choice obvious. He walked us home. He will walk you home too. If this story moves something in you today, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Share it with someone who is in dark water right now. Someone who is holding someone else up and running out of arm. Someone who needs to know that calling out in the dark is enough, that the calling is received, that there is someone already in the water ahead of you. And if you have your own testimony, a moment when Jesus showed up in the exact place where you were and walked you somewhere you could not have walked to alone, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I close, about the day I went to the wall in Norfolk. I went alone. I drove down from Camp Lejeune on a Saturday in May, a clear morning, one of those spring days on the East Coast, where the sky is the specific blue that does not happen in other seasons. I parked and I walked to the installation where the memorial was, and I stood in front of the 17 names for a long time. I knew some of them. Sergeant First Class Torres, who had been working on a citation that was going to be funny when it was finished. Corporal Meadows, 19 years old, from Baton Rouge, his first deployment. Chief Petty Officer Yamamoto, the ship's electronics specialist, who had a daughter starting college in the fall and who had been talking about her the week before the missile hit. I stood there and I thought about why. About the question that does not have an answer available to me or to any human being and may not have one available on this side of whatever comes next. I stood there and I did not resolve it. I stood there and I held it with both hands, the grief and the gratitude together, the 17 names and my own name which should have been up there and was not. And I let them exist in the same space without trying to make them into a theology. And then I said to whoever was listening, which I know now with a certainty I did not have before the Strait of Hormuz is not no one. I said, I don't understand this. I don't think I'm supposed to understand this. But I'm going to live the life I was walked home to. I'm going to live it on behalf of every man on this wall who didn't walk home. I'm going to pay attention on Sunday mornings for every one of them. I drove back to Camp Lejeune. The sky was still blue. The road was the same road. And the presence that had been in the water on April 7th was the same presence that was in the car on that Saturday in May, and is the same presence that is available on every ordinary day when there is nothing dramatic to make it obvious. I know that now. I knew it before I had the words for it. I know it more completely every morning that I sit down with the same intention my mother had at the kitchen table before the rest of the house was awake. He walked us home. He is walking you home too. One final thing. Danny Carver called me on a Sunday morning in June, 8 weeks after Midland. He called at 8:15, which is before church time in Texas, and I was already up, and I answered on the second ring. He said, Mitch. I said, Lieutenant. He said, you need to stop calling me Lieutenant. I'm on medical leave. I said, old habits. He laughed. He said he had been thinking about something and wanted to tell me. He said Grace had taken her first steps. 13 months old, on a Tuesday afternoon in their kitchen in Midland, while Claire was washing dishes and he was sitting on the floor watching her. He said she walked to him, 4 steps, fell into his hands, looked at him with the specific expression of a baby who has just discovered something important and is not sure what to do with the discovery. He said, Mitch, I was in the Strait of Hormuz, and Jesus Christ walked us home so I could be on the floor of my kitchen when my daughter took her first steps. I said, yeah. He said, I don't know what comes next. I don't know what this means for my career, or for Claire, or for the rest of the plan I had for my life. But I know that. I know that specific thing. And I'm going to let it be enough until the rest of it becomes clear. I said that seemed right to me. He said, you paying attention on Sunday mornings? I said yes. He said good. We talked for a few more minutes about other things, the recovery, the battalion, mutual friends. Then we said goodbye, and I sat in my kitchen in Jacksonville, North Carolina, with the phone on the table and the early June morning outside the window, and the full awareness that I was alive in a specific and concrete way that I had not been fully alive in for the previous 31 years. The way you are alive when you know what it cost, and you know who paid it, and you know what the life is for. He walked us home. That is what I know. Everything else I'm still learning,